December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital, Hawaii. Dr. Lieutenant Commander Ralph Higgins stood in the bright, sterile operating room, confident in his surgical abilities as the first casualties began arriving. The instruments gleamed under powerful overhead lights, just as they had during his residency at Johns Hopkins. With modern equipment and proper illumination, "We can save almost anyone," he assured his nervous staff, unaware that within months this fundamental belief would be completely upended. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how American military medicine abandoned decades of surgical convention during World War II, deliberately operating in near darkness and achieving survival rates that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. A revolution born not from advanced technology, but from its deliberate absence. In the chaotic weeks after Pearl Harbor, military hospitals across the Pacific scrambled to prepare for war. The United States Navy had entered the conflict with surgical protocols largely unchanged since the First World War. Standard operating theater design emphasized one thing above all else: bright, unwavering illumination. Multiple overhead lamps, typically 500 watts each, bathed the surgical field in harsh, white light. This was considered absolutely essential for any serious procedure. "The surgeon must see clearly to operate effectively," read the 1938 Navy Medical Corps manual. Adequate illumination is the foundation of modern surgical practice. Dr. Higgins had spent 8 years training under these conditions. His operating rooms at Pearl Harbor featured the latest lighting systems, with backup generators ensuring they would never go dark. What he and other military surgeons couldn't foresee was how completely the Pacific Theater would upend these established practices. By January 1942, casualties were mounting across the Pacific. On the island of Bataan in the Philippines, Navy Lieutenant Commander James Whitaker supervised a field hospital supporting American and Filipino forces. Unlike the well-equipped facility at Pearl Harbor, Whitaker's hospital occupied an abandoned school building with unreliable electricity. "The first night air raid caught us mid-procedure," Whitaker later wrote in his journal. "A young corpsman named Wilson Garcia made a split-second decision that likely saved the patient's life. Rather than evacuating, he quickly covered the windows with blankets and continued holding the small flashlight while I completed the appendectomy in near darkness." What seemed like a desperate emergency measure would soon become deliberate policy. Throughout February and March, as Japanese forces intensified bombing raids across the Philippines, medical personnel made a startling observation. Lieutenant Eliza Morrison, a nurse with the Army Nurse Corps, documented the pattern in her reports. "Patients operated on during blackout conditions are showing remarkably lower rates of post-surgical infection," she wrote on March 14, 1942. "Initially, we attributed this to coincidence, but the statistical difference has become too significant to ignore." The numbers were indeed compelling. At Bataan Field Hospital No. 3, surgeons tracked 100 consecutive abdominal procedures. Among 53 patients operated on under standard lighting, 28 developed serious infections, a 53% infection rate consistent with pre-war statistics. But among 47 patients who underwent surgery during blackout conditions, with only minimal directional lighting, just 11 developed infections, a 23% rate. This pattern repeated across multiple field hospitals. At first, military doctors were skeptical, attributing the difference to random chance or other variables. Captain Harley Davidson, no relation to the motorcycle company, who served as chief surgeon at the 7th Field Hospital near Corregidor, initially dismissed the reports. "Proper illumination has been surgical doctrine since Lister," he noted in April 1942, referencing Joseph Lister, the pioneer of antiseptic surgery. "The idea that darkness somehow improves outcomes contradicts everything we know about surgical practice." Yet the evidence continued to mount. By mid-1942, as American forces established field hospitals on Guadalcanal and other Solomon Islands, the phenomenon became impossible to ignore. Medical units operating under constant threat of air attack were routinely performing surgeries with minimal lighting, often just a single shielded lamp directed at the surgical field, and documenting substantially better outcomes. Major William Crawford, a microbiologist attached to the 3rd Marine Division, began investigating the phenomenon. His background proved crucial. Before the war, Crawford had studied under Dr. Rebecca Lansfield at the Rockefeller Institute, researching how different light conditions affected bacterial growth. The explanation may be surprisingly straightforward, Crawford wrote in his preliminary findings. Many pathogenic bacteria, particularly Staphylococcus aureus, Streptococcus pyogenes, and certain Clostridium species, exhibit increased virulence when exposed to intense visible light. We've observed this in laboratory conditions, but never considered its implications for surgical practice. Crawford's hypothesis was radical but elegantly simple. The powerful lights used in traditional operating rooms were actually promoting bacterial growth and increasing the virulence of contaminants that inevitably entered surgical wounds. To test this theory, Crawford and his team established a controlled study at a field hospital on New Caledonia in August 1942. 120 patients requiring similar procedures were randomly assigned to 2 groups. 60 underwent surgery in traditional brightly lit operating theaters. The other 60 had identical procedures performed in modified theaters with minimal directed lighting, typically a single 25-watt lamp with a narrow beam focused only on the surgical field. The results were stunning. Among the bright light group, 33 patients, 55%, developed significant post-operative infections. In the reduced light group, only 14 patients, 23%, developed infections. The mortality rates showed an even more dramatic difference: 12 deaths in the bright light group compared to just 5 in the reduced light group. Crawford's findings reached Admiral James Wellington, the Navy's Surgeon General, in October 1942. Wellington, a traditionalist who had performed surgery the same way for 30 years, was initially dismissive. "This seems to contradict the fundamentals of modern surgical practice," he noted in his response. However, the results warrant further investigation. That further investigation soon became one of the most ambitious medical studies conducted during wartime. Between November 1942 and February 1943, 24 military hospitals across the Pacific Theater participated in a coordinated trial of what was now being called Reduced Illumination Surgical Technique, or RIST. The study involved over 3,000 surgical procedures, meticulously documented, despite the challenges of wartime record-keeping. Surgeons who had trained their entire careers to operate under bright lights were now asked to adapt to conditions that would have been considered dangerously inadequate just months earlier. Not everyone embraced the change. Commander Gregory Harrison, chief surgeon at the Naval Hospital in Brisbane, Australia, initially refused to participate. "This is reckless experimentation that places patients at unnecessary risk," he wrote in a scathing memo. "Surgery requires optimal visualization. Asking surgeons to operate in darkness is like asking pilots to fly blindfolded." Harrison's objection highlighted a significant challenge. Surgeons had developed techniques dependent on full visibility. Operating with minimal lighting required different approaches: more tactile awareness, greater reliance on palpation rather than visual inspection, and modified instrument handling. Lieutenant Sarah Daniels, an operating room nurse who had worked with civilian surgeons before the war, observed the varying adaptability among medical personnel. "The younger surgeons adjust more quickly," she noted in January 1943. "Doctors who trained after 1935 seem to adapt to reduced lighting within a few procedures. The older surgeons struggle more, some never fully adapt." One young surgeon who embraced the new approach was Lieutenant Commander Michael Chen, a Chinese-American doctor who had faced discrimination in civilian practice before finding greater acceptance in the Navy Medical Corps. Chen had performed hundreds of surgeries in Shanghai during the 1930s, often under compromised conditions due to Japanese bombing. "This reminds me of operating during blackouts in China," Chen told his colleagues at the 42nd Evacuation Hospital on Guadalcanal. "We adapted then because we had no choice. The difference is that now we're discovering it actually improves outcomes." Chen began developing specialized techniques for dark surgery, as it was informally called. He advocated for instruments with textured handles that could be distinguished by touch rather than sight. He pioneered a technique for suturing that relied more on tactile feedback than visual guidance, which he taught to other surgeons in practical workshops. Most surgical procedures involve tissues that feel distinctly different. Chen explained during a training session in March 1943. With practice, your fingers can see these differences as well as your eyes, sometimes better. By April 1943, the results of the wrist study were clear. Across all participating hospitals, reduced illumination procedures showed a 47% decrease in serious post-operative infections compared to traditional bright light surgeries. Mortality rates for major abdominal procedures dropped from 26% to just 11%. Admiral Wellington, now convinced by the evidence, issued a directive that would transform military surgical practice, effective immediately. All Pacific Theater surgical facilities will implement reduced illumination surgical technique as standard protocol. Operating theaters will be modified to provide only necessary directed lighting not exceeding 50 watts total illumination. The directive encountered resistance from some senior medical officers who had built their careers around established techniques. Commander Harrison remained skeptical, writing, "We are abandoning decades of progress based on a statistical anomaly observed under chaotic conditions." To address such concerns, the Navy Medical Corps established a formal training program. Mobile surgical teams led by physicians experienced with the new techniques, including Lieutenant Commander Chen, traveled between hospitals demonstrating the methods and helping staff adapt. One of the most remarkable aspects of the transition was how it affected different types of procedures. For soft tissue surgeries, the benefits of reduced lighting were substantial, but not dramatic. Infection rates dropped by about 30%. But for procedures involving the abdominal cavity, particularly those addressing traumatic injuries to the intestines, the improvement was astounding. Infection rates decreased by nearly 70%, and mortality dropped by more than half. The explanation for this difference emerged from laboratory studies conducted by Major Crawford and a team of microbiologists working in a makeshift lab on New Caledonia. They discovered that the bacteria most affected by light exposure were precisely those normally found in the intestinal tract, the primary contaminants in abdominal wounds. These organisms, particularly Escherichia coli, Enterococcus faecalis, and various anaerobes, show markedly increased growth rates and toxin production when exposed to bright visible light, Crawford reported in June 1943. The effect is most pronounced with the high-intensity unfiltered light typically used in operating theaters. The scientific explanation involved photochemical reactions within the bacteria. Certain wavelengths of visible light, particularly in the blue spectrum, triggered metabolic changes in these organisms, essentially switching them from a relatively passive state to an aggressive one. This phenomenon had been observed in laboratory settings since the 1920s, but had never been connected to surgical outcomes. By mid-1943, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, newly established field hospitals were being designed specifically for reduced illumination surgery. Gone were the multiple overhead lights. Instead, operating rooms featured a single adjustable lamp producing a narrow beam of yellow filtered light, specifically designed to minimize bacterial stimulation while providing just enough illumination for surgeons to work. The adaptation process wasn't without challenges. Training programs had to be developed for surgeons and nursing staff. New instruments were designed with features that could be easily distinguished by touch. Surgical drapes were modified with tactile reference points to help orient physicians working with limited visual guidance. Lieutenant Ann Miller, an operating room nurse who served aboard the hospital ship USS Relief, described the transformed surgical environment in her memoir. The operating rooms would have been unrecognizable to civilian doctors, while she wrote, where once every surface gleamed under harsh white light, now the spaces were dim, almost intimate. Surgeons worked with their faces close to the wound, often with their eyes half closed, their hands moving with a pianist's sensitivity. The only significant light came from a single lamp with an amber filter, focused tightly on the essential field. The transformation extended beyond just lighting. As surgeons adapted to working with reduced visual information, they developed enhanced tactile skills that improved their technique even in well-lit environments. Commander James Patterson, a neurosurgeon who initially opposed the change, became one of its strongest advocates after experiencing its benefits firsthand. "I can now distinguish tissue types by touch more accurately than I ever could by sight alone," he reported in August 1943. "This has improved my surgical precision even when full lighting is available." By late 1943, as the reduced illumination technique became standard practice in Pacific Theater military hospitals, another unexpected benefit emerged. Surgeons could continue operating during air raids without interruption. Traditional operating rooms had to cease procedures during blackouts, often with life-threatening consequences for patients already under anesthesia. Under the new protocols, surgeries continued regardless of external conditions. Captain Elizabeth Warren, who commanded a field hospital supporting Marine operations on Tarawa, documented this advantage during the intense fighting in November 1943. "Last night, we performed 17 consecutive surgeries during repeated air raid warnings," she wrote. "Under previous protocols, we would have been forced to stop multiple times, likely losing several patients. Instead, we worked continuously through the night, with no adjustments needed when the blackout sirens sounded. Of the 17 critical cases, 15 survived, an outcome that would have been impossible under the old system." The success in the Pacific prompted military medical leaders to implement similar changes in the European theater, though with some resistance. European hospitals, often established in requisitioned civilian buildings with reliable power supplies, had maintained traditional surgical practices. The idea of deliberately reducing lighting seemed counterintuitive to many medical officers who hadn't witnessed the Pacific experience firsthand. Colonel Robert Thompson, who transferred from Pacific service to oversee surgical training for the Normandy invasion, encountered significant skepticism when he introduced the concept to European theater medical staff in early 1944. "These doctors looked at me as if I'd suggested they should operate blindfolded," Thompson later recalled. "They had not experienced the conditions that forced Pacific surgeons to adapt, so they couldn't appreciate how this apparent regression actually represented progress." Nevertheless, as troops prepared for the D-Day landings, several forward surgical units were trained in reduced illumination techniques. The anticipated conditions, field hospitals operating under blackout conditions, often with limited power supply, made the Pacific innovations relevant to the European campaign. Among those who embraced the new approach was Major Margaret Crabtree, one of the few female surgeons serving with the Army Medical Corps. Before the war, Crabtree had worked in rural Appalachia, often performing emergency procedures in homes with minimal electricity. This experience made her particularly receptive to the reduced illumination technique. "This validates what country doctors have known for generations," Crabtree commented during training. "Sometimes, less technology produces better results because it forces us to rely on more fundamental skills." Following the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, forward surgical units put these techniques into practice under combat conditions. The results mirrored those seen in the Pacific. At the 24th Evacuation Hospital supporting troops advancing through Normandy, surgeons using reduced illumination techniques reported infection rates 53% lower than comparable units using traditional lighting. As word of these outcomes spread, the new approach gained acceptance even among initially skeptical European theater medical officers. By September 1944, reduced illumination surgery had become standard protocol for forward medical units supporting the Allied advance across France. The technique proved particularly valuable during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when many field hospitals lost electrical power due to fuel shortages and battle damage. Units trained in reduced illumination surgery continued operating effectively, while those dependent on traditional lighting struggled. Colonel William Davis, who directed medical services during the Ardennes campaign, later credited the adapted surgical techniques with saving hundreds of lives during the crisis. "When conventional hospitals were paralyzed by power outages, our forward units continued performing life-saving surgeries with minimal disruption," Davis wrote in his official report. What began as a Pacific theater adaptation proved equally valuable in the harsh winter conditions of the European campaign. By early 1945, as the war approached its conclusion, reduced illumination surgical technique had been fully integrated into military medical practice across all theaters. The results were reflected in the overall statistics. Among American military personnel who reached a field hospital alive, the survival rate had increased from 78% in 1942 to 94% by 1945, one of the most significant improvements in combat casualty care in military history. The war's end brought new questions about how this wartime innovation would translate to civilian practice. Military surgeons returning to civilian hospitals often found themselves at odds with established protocols that still emphasized maximum illumination. Many struggled to convince civilian colleagues of the benefits they had witnessed firsthand. Dr. Michael Chen, now a commander and recipient of the Legion of Merit for his contributions to surgical technique, faced particular challenges when he attempted to implement reduced illumination methods at San Francisco General Hospital in 1946. The hospital administration viewed it as primitive and retrograde, Chen recalled years later. They had invested in the latest high-intensity lighting systems and couldn't understand why anyone would deliberately operate with less than maximum illumination. The scientific basis for the technique also faced scrutiny in civilian medical circles. Major Crawford, now Professor Crawford at Yale Medical School, published his comprehensive findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association in January 1946, but his work received a mixed reception. The idea that light could actually be detrimental to surgical outcomes contradicted established thinking, Crawford explained in a 1975 interview. Medical practice tends to add technology rather than subtract it. Suggesting that we should use less of something, especially something as fundamental as light, ran counter to the profession's progressive self-image. Nevertheless, the compelling statistics from the war years gradually influenced civilian practice. Several leading medical centers, particularly those with strong connections to military medicine, began experimenting with modified lighting protocols. Johns Hopkins Hospital established a dedicated reduced illumination operating room in 1948, comparing outcomes with traditional theaters. The results consistently supported the wartime findings. After 2 years of controlled trials, Johns Hopkins reported a 34% reduction in post-operative infections when using reduced illumination techniques. Similar results emerged from studies at Mayo Clinic and Massachusetts General Hospital. By 1950, many of the principles developed during wartime had been incorporated into civilian surgical practice, though in modified form. Rather than the near darkness of wartime operating conditions, civilian hospitals adopted intermediate approaches, lower intensity lighting with wavelength filtration to minimize bacterial stimulation, combined with more focused illumination of the surgical field. The impact extended beyond just lighting. The enhanced tactile techniques, developed by military surgeons who had adapted to reduced visual information, became valued skills taught to new generations of medical students. Surgical instruments designed for the wartime conditions, with features distinguishable by touch, found their way into standard surgical kits. Perhaps most significantly, the experience challenged the medical profession's assumption that more technology always produces better outcomes. It demonstrated that sometimes limitations can drive innovations that might otherwise remain undiscovered. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who rose to become the first female Surgeon General of the United States Navy in 1964, reflected on the significance of this wartime discovery in her autobiography. What began as a desperate adaptation to battlefield conditions revealed a fundamental truth about surgical practice, she wrote. Sometimes, the most significant advances come not from adding new technology, but from questioning our basic assumptions about established methods. The reduced illumination technique succeeded precisely because wartime necessity forced us to abandon what we thought we knew and discover what actually worked best. The legacy of this wartime innovation continues in modern surgical practice. While today's operating rooms bear little resemblance to the dim field hospitals of World War II, Many of the principles discovered then have been incorporated into contemporary design. Modern surgical lighting systems use specific wavelengths that minimize bacterial stimulation while optimizing visual information. Surgeons are trained to rely on a combination of visual and tactile information rather than sight alone. The mortality rate for major abdominal surgeries in modern hospitals is less than 2%, a dramatic improvement from the 25 to 30% rates common before World War II. While many factors have contributed to this progress, the fundamental insights gained from those wartime experiences in the Pacific Theater represent one of the most significant paradigm shifts in the history of surgical practice. In his final public address before his death in 1978, Commander Chen, by then Dr. Michael Chen, Professor Emeritus of Surgery at Stanford University, reflected on the unlikely revolution he had helped to spark. We often think of medical progress as a straight line forward, each generation building upon the achievements of the last, he told the graduating class at Stanford Medical School. But sometimes progress requires a willingness to step backward, to question what we believe is essential, to discover that what we thought was primitive might actually be sophisticated in ways we had not recognized. Today, in operating rooms around the world, surgeons work under carefully calibrated lighting systems that balance visibility with optimal bacterial suppression, a direct legacy of those desperate days in Pacific field hospitals when American doctors first discovered that sometimes operating in the dark was the most enlightened approach of all. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.